a seat. Go have a seat. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suzanne Reynolds. I'm the Dean of the Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Sager Series. There are two reasons why we get such fabulous speakers for the Sager Series. One is that the program enjoys the leadership of Professor Omari Simmons. Professor Simmons is our Howard L. Olick Professor of Business Law and the Director of our Business Law program. He asks and they say yes. And another reason they say yes, in addition to the persuasiveness of Professor Simmons, is that the program is named for Tom Sager. They don't say no when they realize they're going to be a speaker in a series named for Tom Sager. Tom Sager is a 1976 alumnus of this law school. He was long-term executive vice president and general counsel of DuPont. Not only did he give DuPont superb legal service, but he also made DuPont famous in two ways. For the DuPont legal model. It is a benchmark for the industry of how general counsel and lawyers in the counsel office work in a corporation. It's, as I say, it has become the industry standard. It wins national acclaim long after Mr. Sager left DuPont and went into private practice with Ballard Spahr. The other reason DuPont became famous under the leadership of Tom Sager is for its diversity initiatives. Tom Sager, early proponent for the corporation, is stronger. Indeed, society is stronger if we embrace diversity. For both of these initiatives, DuPont and Tom Sager are famous. Tom Sager is with us today. Tom, I'm going to embarrass you and ask you to stand so we can recognize you. So because of Tom Sager and Professor Simmons, we have with us today Greg Glidden. He is the Executive Vice President and the General Counsel for General Motors, supervising lawyers in 30 countries. He graduated with a BA from Tulane and a law degree from Florida State, where he was the editor-in-chief of the Law Review and the managing editor of the Law Review. From there, he went into private practice. He went with Chevron Phillips after that, then with LyondellBasell, one of the largest chemical plastics refining companies in the world, and from there to General Motors. Quite a ride. And to help us understand this quite remarkable career, Professor Simmons is going to lead us in a conversation with Greg Glidden. Thank you.
All right, thank you. What I want to do is first, once again, acknowledge Tom Sager for the inspiration he gives this series, but also I wanted to acknowledge the Provost Office for the support they've given to this event. This event is a part of the Rethinking Community series, and we're glad to have it. But I definitely want to thank our speakers. Not every day that we have the opportunity to have an officer from one of the America's iconic companies share legal insights. And we couldn't have a better person who could talk about the intersection of law and emerging business issues. So thank you for joining us from Detroit. We brought good weather, too.
Yes, indeed. And I also, before we get started, want to acknowledge some of my colleagues, Brian Pike and Brianna Green, who are here today. Raise your hand. Brianna and Brian are both in the operations group, and I was telling Tom before we started that we're commencing a convergence program, which DuPont did almost 25 years ago. We're starting it now at GM, and one of the things I secured was Tom's agreement to come to Detroit and work with us. So thank you, Tom. Appreciate that.
All right, so what I'd like to do for the next 30 minutes, you and I'll have a conversation, and then we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. A good place to start is your background, your hometown, and things about your schooling or whatever you want to share.
Okay. Well, I was born in Pontiac, Michigan. I had forgotten about that pretty much most of my life until I moved back to Detroit. But like a typical migration that happened in the early 60s, my grandparents moved to Florida, and then we followed them, and I grew up on the west coast of Florida. And the way it intersects with the law is that in my small beachfront community that I grew up in, the lawyers were pillars of the community. And my mom was a single mom, 2 sons, and so I was always looking for role models. And the role models I picked as a young child were the lawyers in town. And they were president of the local Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club or whatever. And so I decided early on that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so that's pretty much what I stayed focused on throughout my entire time when I was in high school and then graduated going to college. And when I decided I was going to go to law school, I wanted to go back to Florida. So I went to Florida State, which is in the state capital of Florida. And so I thought I was going to live in Florida for the rest of my life, practicing law as a lawyer. And so I moved to Tampa, which is one of the larger communities in Florida, and I started my practice as a litigator a long time ago.
And so now we get the idea of why you're interested in law. How was law school for the students? How was it for you?
Well, it was interesting. First of all, I thought I was pretty hot stuff. I really did. I had done very well at Tulane, and I kind of felt like, you know, I was doing Florida a favor by going back to school in Florida. I then realized that it's not so easy, and there was one guy in my class who was a newspaper reporter for the Tallahassee newspaper, and what I realized, his ability to write, his ability to synthesize facts, and his ability not to bury the lead made him the #1 student in the class. And I wasn't that. So I started to try and climb as much as I could. I was humbled at the outset and ultimately, you know, finished up doing pretty well. But law school was tough. And I worked at it really hard. I had just gotten married when I started law school. So that may be a little different than for a lot of you, but back in the day, that's kind of what you did. And so that helped some. But, you know, the thing that I really remember most about my law school years was the way it opened my mind to the possibilities of what could happen in my life. And then also, particularly, the work on the law review was really important because I don't know that anybody read the stuff we wrote, but it sure was hard getting it out the door. And making sure that all of the sites, I remember pages from the Blue Book, you know, I can know exactly whether it's, you know, an id, an ibid, or whatever it was, whether it's EG. To this day, I still italicize all my EGs and end with a comma because nobody knows how to do that anymore. But that was one of the skills we picked up on back in the day.
Okay. Now I'd like to talk about a little bit about your career prior to GM.
Okay.
Could you talk about how those experiences shape you and also prepared you for your current role?
Mm-hmm. So after I graduated from law school, I took a job at a law firm in Florida that was the oldest law firm in Florida at the time. Actually, you would go into the office and people would wear seersucker suits and white bucks. That's how old line this law firm was. But I liked it because I wasn't from that and I wanted to be part of that. So I gravitated towards this law firm, and it was a great law firm. I wanted to do trial work because I had always been a good arguer, and but it turned out they didn't have any spots in the personal injury section, which is the section that goes to trial most often. So I got put in the complex litigation department, and which was really fascinating because the range of cases that I handled really exposed me to the possibilities of the law. So one of the first cases I handled was a case about the constitutionality of the Interest on Lawyers Trust Account program, which is the vehicle whereby legal services are funded, pro bono legal services are funded in a lot of states around the country. And so having the opportunity to argue those kind of constitutional cases, I also had an Equal Protection Clause case involving a rental car company and whether they could charge off-airport rental car companies the same fees that they charged on-airport rental car companies. We ultimately lost that case, and that's why you still pay more at Alamo and Budget. But a lot of interesting cases. And then one of the things that happened was because I was working on some of these interesting cases, there was one case that came into the office where we were not the primary counsel, we were the local counsel. And the primary counsel were these rock star lawyers from Houston, Texas. And they came in and they were just immaculate. They were prepared, they were on their game, and Houston at the time was probably, Tom can probably attest to this, Texas has got a lot of good litigators. And these guys had just split off from Fulbright, started their own firm, And so they hired me, and I was the box guy on the case, meaning I had all the document work and working on the request for production and interrogatories and so forth. But I really liked them, and we worked together well. And then after a little while of working with them, they asked me to move to Houston. And what I learned from those early experiences were that it really took a lot to be good at the law. I mean, if any of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's book about being good at something, it takes a lot of time. And so I put in a lot of time and kind of perfected my ability to do the skills that I was practicing then, and it got me noticed. And so ultimately, I've been kind of drug along through my career. It hasn't been really me pointing and wanting to go somewhere. More, it has been me doing the best job I can in the job that I'm in, and then an opportunity opens up as a result. So going from Florida to Houston was a game changer for me, because then I was in this much larger market from a legal perspective than I thought I was going to be.
Okay. And now I'd like to talk a bit more about your role at GM. Can you talk
Okay.
about your role in GM and also the legal department?
Okay, well, let's start with first of all, let's start with the legal department. So I hired into GM in March of 2015. And a little bit of history as to why this happened. I would not normally have been hired into GM. I don't think under any set of facts they would have called and asked for me. But there was an issue that arose at GM back in 2014 that involved a defective ignition switch on a series of vehicles that resulted in a massive recall. And GM was in a tough spot. There were investigations that were being pursued by the SEC, by the Justice Department, by the Southern District of New York. We had hundreds of class actions. We had thousands of personal injury cases that were piling up all over. And at that point in time, they were confronting a crisis. So in my career in Houston, I had gotten pretty good at some of this crisis business, because a lot of what I did in the petrochemical industry, as Tom can attest, you know, it's a very dangerous industry, and sometimes bad things happen. And so we've had, you know, significant explosions that I've had to deal with over the course of time. And safety was very important to me. I mean, if you work in that business long enough, safety is a religion. And I was a safety advocate. And I think at that moment, that was something that GM could really use, because there was a big report that came out about what happened in this crisis, and the legal department was figured prominently in the report. And we actually did a case study on it at my other company to see whether or not we thought it could happen at our company. We thought that there were differences in the way we did things that would probably prevent it, but you can never be too sure. So as a result of some connections that had developed over the years, there was somebody on the board of GM that knew me, knew of me, knew my passion for safety, and suggested that maybe they talk to me. And so that's how I wound up going to interview with them. And the reason why I took the job was, A, I believe strongly in the power of the in-house profession to add value to a company and be a force for good. B, I believe very strongly in the power of lawyers to add value to a company. And I felt like this was a rare opportunity to have an opportunity to really try and practice what I preach on a very large scale. So that's why I took the job in March of 2015.
Okay. Now, you talked about value.
Mm-hmm.
A couple questions there in terms of how do you create value for your corporate client? And then the other part about it is that how do you actually communicate it
Okay.
to leadership and your other clients?
So I think the way you create value for the corporate client is the killer app for any in-house lawyer is intimate knowledge of the business coupled with legal acumen, putting those two things together, and to be able to provide a solution that maybe the client would not think of on their own. Because by and large, they're focused on the business, and they're focused on the view of the business that they typically have. What they may not necessarily have is the benefit of how the law can either help or hurt them in accomplishing their objectives. And so that's why I think the in-house profession is uniquely situated to help, because that's how you get the in-depth knowledge of the business. I'll give you an example of where recently that has kind of come to fore. So we are a big trader on the world stage. We sell more cars in China than we do in the United States. And we have large operations all over the world. And one of the things that you see happening as a lawyer, particularly if you have any interest in trade law, is you see that the world of trade law is starting to change. There's a shift underway. There's been a global trading system that's been in existence since World War II that largely the United States was the architect of, and some of the fundamental foundations of that trading system are being challenged by the U.S. administration. And the question is, how does that impact our trade flows and where we make our vehicles and where we can import or export our vehicles? And the business is typically thinking about, how do I get the lowest engineering and or development costs per unit? That's what they think of. And so what that means is they will put production facilities in areas where the cost to produce is relatively low. But if the trading system changes such that you can't import those vehicles without there being a reciprocal tariff or other things, it undermines potentially the business case that's been used to justify why the production moved to a particular spot in the first instance. So that's where I think we try and bring what we're seeing on the trade side together with what we understand on the business side and offer it up to the business as an alternative way of looking at it. It's not maybe that the result's going to change, but at least they're aware of it. Now, back to your earlier question about the legal department, because I kind of skipped it over. So when I came, the legal department was smaller than it is today. We've been growing the legal department. We're up to about 400 total personnel, about 250 lawyers. About 170 of those lawyers are located in the United States, and about 80 of them are located around the world. We have reorganized ourselves. When I arrived, it was predominantly geographically organized. And what I wanted to do was try and organize it more along practice discipline. So the commercial team is largely together. The litigation team is largely together. The compliance team is largely together. And then those teams have global responsibilities. That doesn't mean that we don't have, individual people in various countries around the world, but that we have centers of excellence that are on a practice group basis able to project their force around the world. And so the idea is that if there's a transaction in China that involves intellectual property, I don't have to have all of the intellectual property horsepower that I would need to do that transaction in China. I can pivot and use some of the resources we have in the United States. So it's trying to leverage off of centers of excellence and being close to the clients. We've been undergoing a pretty significant change management process as well. So since I've been at the company, the total population of the legal staff has probably changed over 50%. And a lot of that was because I was trying to bring in new skills and complementary skills to people that were already there to try and build a more powerful team that could deliver the kind of value I think that GM is desirous of having. And the one thing I know that we'll probably get to it, but I want to flag it so we can talk about it at some point. The other surprise to me when I came to GM is I thought I was really coming to solve the ignition switch problem and that I was going to fix it, and once it was fixed, it was all going to be great. What I didn't realize was I was actually walking into a business that was about to be hugely disrupted. Automobile ownership as we know it is under huge attack through rideshare and through autonomous vehicles, and even the model as to whether or not people will continue to own vehicles going forward. And so what GM has done has been very aggressive in trying to address these new trends. So I didn't know any of this was going on when I joined. By the end of 2015, we had bought a significant interest in Lyft. By the spring of 2016, we acquired an autonomous vehicle software company in California named Cruise. And just recently, Navigate came out with a study that said that General Motors was ahead of Waymo in terms of the development of autonomous vehicles, because we not only have the software side of it, we also have the deep manufacturing knowledge and expertise to bring it all together. And we've announced that we're going to launch our first ride-sharing fleet of autonomous vehicles in 2019. And we're not doing it in Sunnyvale, California. We're doing it in the streets of San Francisco. And if you've ever been on the streets of San Francisco, you will realize that it goes like this, and there's stuff coming from everywhere. And I was just out there a couple weeks ago in an autonomous vehicle going around San Francisco, and it was amazing how receptive and reactive this vehicle was to the changing conditions around there. So it's a pretty exciting time at the company.
And to follow on with that concept of disruption, this past fall we had a conference here, a Toward Symposium, and one of the participants had mentioned how the liability paradigm is shifting, whereas you will see manufacturers shouldering a lot more of liability for car accidents rather than human drivers. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it still remains to be worked out, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to own all these cars in the fleet. So initially, autonomous vehicles will not be made available to individuals on a personal basis. It'll start with rideshare fleets that are owned and maintained by the manufacturer or an affiliate of the manufacturer. And we will obviously, to the extent the automated driving system in the vehicle makes a mistake, we will be responsible for that. The interesting thing is, in these autonomous vehicles, the accident reconstruction capability is virtually 360 and 100%. We have cameras, we have long-range radar, which are called LiDARs, we have sensors. You can virtually recreate what happens at any point in time. You can track the speed of all vehicles around you, you can track bicycles, you can track pedestrians, and it's all in Technicolor. So while we may be responsible, we'll also be able to explain instances where we're not responsible in a much more persuasive way. And it is a fact that 94% of all accidents are caused by human drivers. That's just a fact. And so I think we'll be okay.
All right. Well, in keeping with that, I wanted to talk a bit about the unique role of the general counsel and how that compares to outside law firms. And then a related question to that, especially with Tom here, this idea of convergence and what goes into making the decision versus do you make the services, that is, handle them internally or buy them on the spot market with external law firms? What are some of the considerations that come into play?
Okay. Let's first start with the role of the general counsel. So the general counsel is the trusted advisor to the CEO, senior leaders, and the board of directors. And that trust is really, really important because in times of stress, you need to be able to call upon that person. The way I like to think about it is the general counsel really doesn't have any other agenda except what's in the best interest of the company. If a general counsel is jockeying for a position, then the general counsel is risking the trust and empathy of the other senior executives. So, you know, if you've all watched Game of Thrones, Eddard Stark is kind of the general counsel, and he died early in the show, by the way. But that's kind of the thing you're trying to channel as the general counsel. But the thing that's changed since I started practice was back in the day, the senior partners of my White Shoe law firm in Tampa, Florida, were the ones that went and hung with the CEO and vacationed with him or were the trusted advisors. Over the course of time, those senior partners can't get in to see the CEO. They got to go over the top of the general counsel first. And so that doesn't happen very much. So what's occurred is an intermediary, essentially, between private law firms and the executive suite, the C-suite, has been formed, and it's called the in-house legal department, for good reason. Because in the early days, you know, frankly, executives that don't have the benefit of legal training were pretty much at risk to be taken advantage of by law firms. Didn't happen all the time, a lot of great work, but still it could happen. So having a guardian at the gate, if you will, I think was a logical thing. The other thing is that the general counsel also is in a position to be the conscience of the company, the guardian of the company's interest, and while we obviously want to partner with the business, we have to recognize that at the end of the day, we represent the company, we don't represent the executives. We partner with the executives to the extent in furtherance of representing the company, but when an executive does bad, we represent the company. That's just the way we do it. And we have a very clear message in our legal team about who we represent. And so I think the role of the general counsel, and so there's an art form in knowing that, you represent the company, but essentially also letting everyone else know that you're there to partner with them as much as possible to create value.
No, and you mentioned some of those relationships that the general counsel has with the senior leadership team. I wanted to also talk about some other relationships that perhaps are internal to the company as well. Employees, one, and then the second one we had talked about earlier in the car about earnings reports and the idea of shareholders and the degree of your engagement with shareholder issues.
Well, the engagement's pretty intense because shareholders are a very demanding group. So we have what's happened now is there are a lot of activists that are out there, and today we just had our earnings, knock on wood. It all went very good. Our stock was up when I sat down for this meeting. But what can happen is the idea of shareholder rights has been taken by some segments of the financial world to an extreme whereby it gets turned on its head in the form of ill-conceived activist campaigns. Now, I'm not saying that companies should be immune from activism, because companies sometimes need some activism. But, for example, last year, GM had an activist. We had to withstand a proxy fight from Greenlight, which was an activist company. And their pitch was that we should separate the stock of GM into two different types. One would be an income-producing dividend stock, and the other would be a growth stock that did not get the benefit of a dividend. Now, we checked this with our large institutional shareholders and others, and generally it was not perceived to be a good idea. But we had to go through a long proxy contest with a lot of advisors, a lot of expense, and ultimately we won by 93% of all shareholder votes. It was kind of dead on arrival. But still, there was no way to get it resolved before ultimately going through the shareholders' vote that happened months and months after it was first. So I do think one of the things I'm trying to do is to suggest that there ought to be some balance in the system whereby long-termism is also thought of at the same time short-termism is thought of. Because you have a situation where for short-term advantage, a company can really avoid making the investments that it needs to make in the long term to protect long-term shareholder values in order to keep the stock price up in the short term, whether it's through a variety of mechanisms, whether it's share buybacks or other things. So there has to be a balance between long-termism and short-termism, and the General Counsel plays a significant role in all of that. The other thing I'll say about shareholders that's a big thing is that proxy advisory firms are something that has really come to the fore lately, and so some firms rely on proxy advisory firms to tell them how to vote in a shareholder vote. So if you get ISS or Glass Lewis voting one way, contrary to the interest of management, you just have to be very concerned about that. So we spend a lot of time making sure that ISS and Glass Lewis knows where we stand on the issues. We also spend a lot of time engaging with our largest shareholders, whether it's State Street, BlackRock, whoever, so that they understand the strategic value that we're trying to deliver. Finally, sustainability is a big issue for shareholders now, and so you have to have a strong, what is now called ESG program, environment, social, and governance program. And so we've advocated a lot on sustainability-related issues as it relates to automotive, and particularly our thrust to envision a world of zero emissions, zero congestion, and zero fatalities. And that's kind of what we're focused on.
Okay. One of the things you talked about the shareholder constituency. What about some others that people think of external stakeholders? The community, when you talk about the greater Detroit area, local, national, international, and global, but also, too, regulators. We can throw regulators as well as customers in that grouping. Can you respond to how your role intersects with those stakeholders?
Well, it intersects with all of them. So you'd mentioned employees, because I want to come back to that too. So the automotive companies are somewhat unique in that to the extent they're located in Michigan and areas surrounding Michigan, the labor force is largely unionized in the plants. So we have a significant and important and constructive relationship with the UAW, United Auto Workers Union. So That is an area, being in the South for most of my practice, I didn't have a tremendous amount of labor union experience. I had some because some of our refineries were unionized, but for the most part, working with the UAW has been kind of a new chapter. It's a constructive relationship, but it's an interesting one. In terms of the other constituencies, the Detroit community is very important to General Motors. General Motors has been there for over 100 years. General Motors is very supportive of the renaissance that is underway in Detroit. A lot of our charitable giving is focused on the Detroit community, but we also have other requirements as well that we focus on from a charitable perspective in building we're focused on sustainable communities, we're focused on STEM research, and we're focused on job training because we want people to be prepared for the workforce of the future. And then I happen to work for the most powerful woman in business. Just let that sink in for a minute. Mary Barra is consistently ranked the most powerful woman in business in the United States, and she leans in on topics as well. So we support Girls Who Code. We're very supportive of a whole host of things. In fact, Mary is announcing today that along with Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, we're going to be sponsoring a mentorship program for women to address some of the issues that have surfaced recently. And we want to encourage both male and female colleagues to work closely together in the workplace. So that also drives a certain constituency. The other thing that's been interesting in my job is the Trump administration. So he was sworn in on January 20th. On January 22nd, the call came in that he wanted to meet with the CEOs of the 3 major automotive companies in the White House in 2 days. So we all shuttled off to D.C. to meet with the president, and it was one of the first meetings ever with the new president, and everybody was there. Bannon, this is before everybody started leaving. Bannon was there, Pence was there, Priebus was there, they were all there, and it was a surreal moment. Yeah, Flynn was not there. But it was a surreal moment because it was like, we might as well have been at Trump Tower and we were still talking about, a real estate development. And the conversation was very, informal, I would say. But the thing that came out of it was that after that meeting, he decided he wanted to make a trip to Detroit and talk about automotive in Detroit. And so the White House hadn't gotten fully staffed up. So they called our office, and we acted as really the advance team for the White House to set up a big gathering that was going to take place outside downtown Detroit that had people from Ford, Chrysler, and GM and other people in the area show up. And so I then became kind of an advance person for the White House. And then my boss was also on the Policy and Strategy Forum. This was the advisory group that was formed that, fortunately for most of the members, dissolved. But that also required a fair amount of interaction on a variety of topics.
Okay. I want to also, we talked about some legal issues. You've touched on crisis management. Mm-hmm. What are the top legal issues that you think face a company like GM? If you could name 3 to 5 or so. Okay.
Well, I think the first one that really comes to mind is this issue of short-termism versus long-termism, and how we try and, I think that confronts every company, but when you're in a company that's capitally intensive like GM, that has long product cycles and long investment cycles, you have to take a longer view. And if the system is set up so that everything is assessed on a short-term basis, it really undermines the ability to make those long-term investments. So I think that applies in our business uniquely because of the capital-intensive nature of it. I think another issue that is significant is autonomous vehicles. It's a huge one for us because essentially we have to get legislation passed in Congress. We have to get rules written in our regulator, which is the NHTSA, because the rules that exist right now assume that there is a driver in the car. So if you take a steering wheel and brake pedals out of the car, you're out of code with the Federal Motor Vehicle Statute. So we have to get NHTSA to grant exemptions and ultimately to write new rules for when there's no wheel in a car and there are no brake pedals in a car. So that's a big one. Another one that I think is very significant is emissions. So right now, there seems to be a bit of a tussle between Washington and California and other states as to what the emission standards should be out to 2030 and beyond. And that's one of the reasons why GM has made a big commitment to electric vehicles. We're going to introduce over 20 different electric vehicles into the market by 2023. And a lot of places around the world are starting to ban internal combustion engines. Paris, for example, by 2040. London. China has significant restrictions that require that in order to have any internal combustion vehicles in your fleet, you have to have a certain percentage of electric vehicles. So the world is ultimately going electric. And how we get there is a significant part of what we're trying to do in the legal department. You know, there's always stuff. There are bad laws on the books about forum shopping and crazy things that happen in litigation and the inability to introduce certain evidence. I mean, I'm all interested in that, but it's probably not existential to the business. It's just an irritant.
Okay. Well, in light of that, I want to talk about what do you find about the job that's the most rewarding, but also, and let's keep it positive, the most challenging as well.
Okay. So the thing I find most rewarding is the response to certainly my team and others in the company to really put the customer at the center of everything we do, particularly from a safety perspective. There are some very tough decisions that get made as to whether or not a vehicle is recalled or not. And one of the things that I think our company does very well, particularly after the learning experience that we had in 2014, is makes the right calls and puts the customer safety at the center and will do what's necessary to make sure that our vehicles are safe. And that's probably been the most rewarding thing for me. That is the most systemic thing that I think if you know, I've been able to contribute to that is a lasting impact. I didn't mention, but we're under a federal monitorship now. Part of the deal as a result of our resolution with the Justice Department was that we agreed that we would have a federal monitor on site for 3 years. And so you know what that means. It means that I have 36 former U.S. attorneys with their ability to run around our place and go anywhere they want and talk to anybody they want to. And if we aren't walking the talk, if we aren't doing what we're saying, they will find it. And fortunately, they are very constructive and cooperative with us. And so that's been challenging. But it's also been positive. Because you know, I believe that we'll reach the end of the monitorship in the allotted time, and the monitor will have very good things to say about us. They have to file reports with the Justice Department every 4 months, and there have been very positive things that are said about us. But it is challenging. You know, we have issues of attorney-client privilege all the time that come up as to what we share with the monitor, what we don't share with the monitor. And we largely err on sharing whatever we can with the monitor. The monitor sits in our meetings where we decide whether or not to make a recall decision or not. The monitor sits in on meetings we have with our board of directors. The CEO and I meet every month with the monitor, or every other month with the monitor. So it's been a challenge, but it's also been a good experience for us.
Okay. Well, now I'd like to switch gears a little bit with the remaining time we have and focus on questions that hopefully guide the students on their careers rather than just getting a job. And start out with the gift of hindsight. Mm-hmm. What would you do differently? Take a different class, different types of exposure?
You know what I would probably do differently is I would probably, because I was interested in being a litigator, and what I found in private practice is the opportunity to go to trial is just not as present as it previously was. And so I probably, if I had it to do it over differently, I would probably do some sort of a stint in a government role so that I could get that trial experience. Because in the government roles, you do tend to get more trial experience, whether it is the U.S. attorney or the state attorney or the attorney general's office or whatever. I'd probably do that a little bit different and try and get some of that experience. Not that I would go into criminal law over the long haul. I probably wouldn't. But it would at least get you up in front of a jury more often than you sometimes can get in front of a jury in private practice. The other thing I'd do is I would expand my definition of what is a dispute resolution lawyer to a lot more than just jury trials. So, Tom's been a trailblazer in alternative dispute resolution and arbitrations and creative ways to resolve disputes. I know that Ken Feinberg was one of your earlier speakers, and Ken Feinberg, for example, was a instrument of great success in how we handled the ignition switch crisis. We set up a claims facility with Mr. Feinberg, and he was able to resolve a lot of claims. So there are ways in which you can creatively assess and resolve disputes that don't just necessarily require an expensive and laborious jury trial. So I would expand my definition of what I would work on beyond just trial work.
Okay. And I'm going to ask another question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. And this question has to do with how do the students get your job? Or so a better way to ask it perhaps would be, how can they prepare themselves to become a general counsel, not just simply based upon the way things are now, but looking out in the future and over the horizon, what skills will they need to have to be a success?
Okay. So, the answer is probably not going to be one you want to hear. But in order to get my job, you have to work like crazy. And you have to make sacrifices because it's a rarefied world. I mean, when you think about it, in a law firm, there are multiple points of influence in a law firm. So you can have multiple partners in a law firm that all are doing very, very well and are all considered to be the best in their particular field. When you get into an in-house world, there's only one general counsel. There may be some really great lawyers throughout that organization, but to get that one job, I mean, some of it is just being at the right place at the right time. It's not so much, a perfect thing. It's just that it works out that way. So what I would suggest you do is don't necessarily try and go for that one job. Give yourself multiple opportunities for success. And if that one job winds up being one of them, then great. But don't set yourself up to go for that one thing. But, in my case, and, other people will do it differently. There are people that are smarter at this than I am. There are some people that are really good networkers. There are some people that, have tremendous academic credentials that advance them maybe beyond their years or whatever. I'm a guy from a small town, the west coast of Florida, single mom. The only way I was going to get anywhere was to work. And that's what I did. And that's what I continue to do now. So it helps me because I'm prepared. I'm just prepared. And I always make sure whenever I walk into a meeting that I know the subject as best as I can know it before I go in, so I don't say something stupid.
All right. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the audience. We have a microphone here for questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last year, GM sold 10 million cars. If you're committed to an autonomous future, how are you going to make enough money with your shareholders?
Well, so what'll happen is, over the course of time, the number of cars that we sell may decline, excluding emerging markets, because emerging markets may not necessarily be ready for autonomous vehicles as soon as the United States will. But what will happen is there'll be a mix in the balance. And so we'll make money on the rideshare business. So we'll also make money on the core portfolio, selling great cars, trucks, crossovers, and SUVs. But then there'll also be this new revenue capability, which is generated through the rideshare business, where we think we'll be able to charge less than rideshare 1.0. It's hard to think of Uber and Lyft as rideshare 1.0, and we're bringing rideshare 2.0 to the world. But we're going to disrupt them. That's the game plan. And we think the total addressable market is much bigger than the automotive market today. And if things go according to plan, it will be much bigger than GM's current business.
Come to GM fairly recently, and there was about 50% turnover in
Yeah.
staff. So what had gone wrong with the in-house program?
Well, I don't know that anything had gone wrong with the in-house program, but it had kind of ossified, is what I'd really say, is that it hadn't challenged itself enough, and so I need people that were going to change things, and I needed to move quickly to do it. You know, the reality is that when you work at General Motors in Detroit, you aren't going to go to work for Ford. People don't really cross-pollinate between the two. And you wouldn't probably go to work for Chrysler either. So you tend to work at GM if you're in Detroit. And so there's a mentality, there's not a lot of other job opportunities in Detroit if you're already at GM. So what I had to do was kind of change from a survival-based culture to a performance-based culture. And so that's what we did. And it was difficult, but I think we're there, and I think people feel pretty good about the level of performance that we have. Yes, sir.
When you talk about sustainability, long-termism versus short-termism, brought to my mind the question of the corporate compliance program and the relationship between the compliance program and the law department. Sometimes they're distinct, sometimes one reports to the other. Usually compliance is, if they're not distinct, compliance is usually part of or reports to the law department. That's something I address in the course. Can you describe the structure at GM now between compliance and the law?
Yes. So,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, so the question was, how is the compliance department structured vis-a-vis the law department at GM? Sometimes compliance exists independently of the legal department. Sometimes it's part of the legal department. So what we've done at GM is compliance is part of the legal department, but the chief compliance officer has a direct line to the audit committee of the board of directors, meets with the audit committee without me being present, and also has a direct line to the CEO as well. So they can bypass me if necessary. The other thing that we have is a lot of companies have what are called up-the-ladder reporting policies. And it came out of Sarbanes-Oxley, which basically involves securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, or a criminal act. And we've expanded the definition of what must be reported up to include a whole host of other things, predominantly vehicle safety related issues. So they can report it to the compliance group, they can report it to the monitor, they can report it separately to their superior. There are multiple avenues, and one of the things we did after 2014, we put in place a Speak Up for Safety program, which requires that if anybody becomes aware of something with respect to a car or with respect to a workplace incident, that they can speak up for safety and submit information about it. And I'm pleased that the legal department is one of the leading groups in raising those Speak Up for Safety issues. So that's how we've dealt with it, is that we have, independent, anonymous reporting capabilities and direct lines on the part of the chief compliance officer to the audit and to the CEO.
So you talked about part of your office works with NHTSA on creating those sort of looking at new regulations for autonomous vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually looks like, the work in your office that you're doing for that, and what type of pedigree the folks have who are in your office working on that issue, where they come from, what they've been doing?
Okay. So there are two things you can look at. If you go to the NHTSA website, there will be a booklet, a brochure we put together called Safety Report on our autonomous vehicle, and it describes how the autonomous vehicle works and what we do to build in redundancy and safety into the system. That's one. Then there's another document on the NHTSA website that is our petition to change the provisions of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards Act that requires a wheel, requires brake pads, and so forth. The people that write those things, one of them, we have the former general counsel of NHTSA on our staff, which helps. But in addition, one of the primary lawyers that is responsible for drafting that kind of stuff was a bankruptcy lawyer before he came to the company. But the thing I've noticed is that bankruptcy lawyers are really good with codes. And a lot of federal statutes, certainly as it relates to regulation, is code-based. And so even though he did not have a history in automotive, the fact that he was wired to be kind of code-oriented in the way he approached it made him a natural, and he's become like a leading renowned expert on the topic. So I I think it's just being kind of predisposed to that kind of thing. And so it's very interesting work because it's both engineering and it's law working together.
All right. Got time for one more.
Yes, sir. Oh, let's
Sweet
go.
time. Thank you, Tom.
I just have a question. As a former engineer, you talked a lot about how you interacted with the board and upper level executives. I was kind of wondering how you interact with the engineering side, the manufacturing side, especially with product recalls being such a big deal in your industry.
You have to speak their language. So I'm not an engineer by training, but growing up in energy and petrochemicals, most all of the professionals that I interfaced with were engineers. And so you have to understand the kinds of things they understand. And when you talk about the law, you have to talk about it in a way that is about results, is about variables, it's about sensitivities, it's about project plans, it's about, you know, milestones, it's about that kind of stuff as opposed to art, because art is hard to explain to an engineer. And, but it can be explained in an artful way, but you got to use language that they understand.
Greg, you have the distinction of me asking the first question of the lecture series. So I want to thank you
Thank you,
profusely
Tom.
for joining us, and it was wonderfully insightful. There were a number of lawyers that were separated as a result of the ignition switch controversy. Could you share with, to the extent you can, with the audience so that they might learn a little bit as to how these lawyers were separated while others remained?
Yes. So essentially, it was about escalation of issues. And the lawyers that were ultimately separated were lawyers that, through a variety of ways, may have obtained personal knowledge about something that could have contributed to the ignition switch and didn't report it and didn't escalate it. That's why we have the up-the-ladder escalation policy applying to a whole host of things now. So the one parting piece of advice I'm going to give you, and it applies whether you're in the corporate world or whether you're in private practice or whatever you do, is act with a sense of urgency. Act with a sense of urgency. Problems never get better with time. And opportunities don't last forever. So you got to be ready to move. And if you become aware of something that gives you consternation, even if you don't know exactly what the root cause of it is, you got to share it with your colleagues. You got to talk it up. You got to explain. We had an issue that arose kind of to show the difference of how we address things now. We had an issue arose in the products liability group that came up, and we were concerned about whether or not there was a safety issue associated with a particular, very rare, unique thing that could happen in a vehicle. And so the decision on these things is ultimately made by the engineers. They're the ones that make the decisions as to whether or not certain recalls are going to be done. But the legal people are very much involved. We got together as a leadership team. We didn't allow the product liability lawyer to handle that issue on their own. We got together as a leadership team. We talked about the facts. And we were united in what we were going to do if there wasn't a recall. And we knew exactly what we were going to do. Fortunately, there was a recall. But if there wasn't a recall, we would have acted and stood together. And that's why sharing the information is so important. And so acting with urgency is as well.
All right, what I wanted to do is bring things to a close, but before I do that, I would say it's been an incredible honor
Thank you.
to have you. Thank you for joining us today from Detroit. And let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks, man.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.